This next session I'm particularly excited about sharing with you because one of the one of the best parts of my job is I get to work with multiple state boards across the country. I get to help with your strategic planning. I do boardsmanship training. I help you with policy development. And as such, I'm hearing from all of you some very similar things. And I would say over the past 3 months, practically every session I've had, every one of your state board meetings I've been in have had one common denominator, and that is you're saying, as we're planning, as we're looking forward, we need to hear from those who are most impacted by our actions, by our policies. We want to hear from the field. We want to hear from teachers. We want to hear from parents. We want to hear from administrators. We want to know what the people in the field are thinking and what they need, because that not only informs our policies, but we need to know about what are some of the implications, what are some unintended consequences. So based upon what conversations I've had with you in the past several months has led to this session, Voices from the Field, Perspectives from Teachers, Students, and Families on Education on the Pandemic. And we have joining us as our moderator and host, Sandy Boyd. Now, Sandy is no stranger to our members. There's no stranger to NASB. She's been with us before, and it's a great friend of our organization. And Sandy is co-founder and CEO of Seek Common Ground. And some of you also know Sandy, where she previously held leadership at Achieve, where she was the COO. And Sandy, just thank you for being with us today. Thank you for being willing to lead this conversation that I think is just one of the most important conversations we're going to have, because not only does it set the context for what has come before, but it's really going to set the context for what comes before and comes after us as we delve into these sessions. So thanks again, Sandy. We appreciate it, and we'll let you take over now.
Thank you, Robert, and thanks again for having me. Really looking forward to this conversation. I want to just give a special thanks to not just Robert, but the whole NASB team, because one thing I think is unique about your organization is that you really always do dedicate time to hearing voices from the field and ensuring that educators, students, and families are at the table when you're discussing policy and practice. And that is really critical. So thank you for giving this conversation the time that it deserves and for being committed to hearing from educators, students, and families as you plan ahead. I have to say, we had such a great discussion in our prep session. I really hope that we can just somehow figure out how to repeat it again. It was so interesting to me. So I'm going to just jump right in and say, first of all, we have an impressive set of panelists. We're going to hear from a lot of people. I'm going to try to bring everyone together so folks can hear from everyone. And I know that their bios are in your materials, so please do check them out. I'm going to spare them the pain of reading through their bios, but I will do a quick introduction as we get started. So just so everyone knows, especially for the panelists, we're going to spend 20 minutes or so just talking first on the educator panel, and then about 20 minutes or so with students and families to sort of get their perspective. And then I'd love to bring everybody together, all of the panelists together, and ask everyone some questions so we can get some good cross conversation. And also at that point, anybody who's listening, who's got questions, you can put them in the chat box, and I will try to make sure we somehow get to your questions during that period of time. Okay, so first up, educators. I want to introduce first Allison Slone, who I think most of you who are probably listening and know. She is a Kentucky State Board member. She's still a Kentucky State Board member. I won't tell that whole story right now. She's also a special ed teacher and the author of a recent paper, NASB paper on parent engagement, which everybody should check out. My friend Sanford Johnson, who's the executive director of Teach Plus in Mississippi, and who some of you may know or have heard of during his time at Mississippi First. And Marla Ucelli-Kashyap, who's the senior director of education issues at the AFT, and board chair of the Learning First Alliance. So thank you for all of you, for being here. And so First, I'm going to start with Allison, and let's just do a little bit of a round robin. But this has been such a challenging year, and I want to start with the current teacher, the current teacher that we've got on the panel. And I just want to first ask you how you're doing, how your year has gone, and what you're hearing from the teachers that you work with, and then we'll go to Sanford and Marla. So Allison?
Hi, I'm very glad to be here today. Thank you. How am I doing? Well, today was our first day back of 5-day, all kids there in person, and I'm here not with my kiddos. So I'm a little nervous about my kids and how they're doing. But other than that, this year has been a challenge, to say the least. Not only am I a special education teacher, but I'm also a parent of a child that's in our public school system who has a special need of dyslexia. So it's been quite the challenge to figure out how to teach my students that have special needs, and my own son with a special need as well, and help him with his schoolwork, and my daughter who's in college and doing everything virtual. So it's been quite a challenge. From our teachers, I'm hearing a broad mixture across the board. I also run a social media group that has 23,000 of our Kentucky teachers in it. And so daily I get messages from teachers all across the state with struggles and questions. They're constantly asking questions, and can you help me figure out how to do this, and what is the policy around this? It has definitely brought a community together of educators to figure out how to go forward and help each other, and we've shared ideas and resources, and I think that's been a positive that's come out of this, is how we can kind of help each other out during times that we struggle. But our teachers are also struggling too, mentally and physically. It's taken its toll on our educators, and I think that's been difficult. But that's something we have to look at going forward, is what are the pressures that we put on our teachers? What are the things that we're asking of them? And is it too much? Is it not enough? And what's working and what isn't? And that's something that I think we've learned through this pandemic, and we need to focus on going forward with our educators.
Great. Sanford?
Yes, as a parent of 2 young children, over this past year, trying to work and parent and make sure that kids have all the resources and all the opportunities that they've needed. Like, it has definitely been a challenge. Very similar to March Madness, it's been survive and advance for the past couple of months. So we're really excited to see the light at the end of the tunnel. I think I would need to first recognize my wife and my children for their resilience during this past 13, 14 months. I also want to acknowledge the strength and resilience and resourcefulness of our teachers, who have rolled with the punches and have really been leaders, not just in their schools, but also in their districts. We had the opportunity to conduct a survey with teachers at the front end of the pandemic, and we've done focus groups on the back end of the pandemic. So we've been able to find out from teachers, what are their biggest challenges here in Mississippi, and what can policymakers do to better support them. And some of the issues that really came up, first and foremost, our teachers are primarily concerned with the needs of their students. And one of the things that came up every single time was around the social and emotional needs of students, recognizing that students are going to come back with a lot, and we're going to need to provide those resources. We're going to need to make sure that we can identify when students have faced trauma over the past couple of months and be able to give them the resources that they need. Teachers have also told us that they want professional development, they want training, not just to address those social and emotional needs, but also to catch students up academically. There's a wide spectrum when it comes down to the amount of actual instruction time that students have received. So there are some major questions that we're going to have to answer in the next years. Again, it's definitely not going to be something that we're going to be able to solve in a couple of months. So there are a lot of questions that we're going to have to answer, but I'm really glad that I get an opportunity to work with teacher leaders in the state of Mississippi to help answer some of those questions.
Thank you, Sanford. And I appreciate that you brought up, I know we talked about this a lot, about there's a tendency sometimes just to focus on kind of the academic side of what this year has been like, but inevitably, whether we're talking to students, parents, or teachers, trauma, social, emotional, mental health issues, whole child issues, that always, that seems to always come to the forefront. I think that's going to be a theme we're probably going to come back to during this discussion. So thanks for teeing that up. Marla, over to you.
Great, thanks, Sandy. It's great to be with everyone, and I could second and third almost everything that both Allison and Sanford said. I want to say it's a privilege for me to be able to speak to you about some of what we're hearing from the several 100,000 of our 1.7 million members who are actual classroom teachers right now, and then a couple of 100,000 others who are school staff. But I always want to be clear that no group of teachers, no organization is monolithic. And everyone has really individual opinions and circumstances and opinions are dictated by those circumstances. So, but it really is the privilege. And I know the best way that I can learn is we listen to our members who are teachers as much as we can. And I really appreciate the work of state board members because I know you do a lot of that too. And maybe even at times when you think you're just taking a walk or getting groceries. So I really appreciate that work. So certainly what we've been hearing from our members is this sense of exhaustion, frankly, that they have been putting in more hours and feeling like they're running to stand still almost. And the biggest concern that we hear from them is about the needs of students. I mean, it started out with just basic needs. Are they hungry? Are we able to get food to them? And then I think moved to a very significant concern, especially for our teachers that teach in urban areas or isolated areas, is where are the kids? Despite a lot of efforts, there are still a percentage of students who they are not able to find, or who for various reasons, if they can engage, sometimes it's very difficult for them to be on video. So that sense of using everything in your power to figure out a different way to connect. I absolutely think that parents and teachers in a strange sort of way have become closer during this time because of their uniting to figure out how am I going to reach this child? How am I going to make this class work? I think that there's one piece, and certainly the training piece, and one of the things that we've found is that peer-to-peer learning in the pandemic has been amazing. So teachers building on each other's strengths. And we've tried to provide at the national level a lot of supports, whether that is on our Share My Lesson website, through webinars, lesson plans, project-based learning, projects that can get done with very few resources, with just what kids have in hand. If all you've got is a cell phone, we can do a project for grades K to 3 that you can actually demonstrate your learning with. I think the one piece that I would add to what's been said so far that our teachers are telling us they need, I mean, absolutely the social emotional health. It makes me think of the thing about an airplane, an oxygen mask, put on your mask before assisting others. And we have to help our educators care for themselves and be taken care of. But I think a critical piece that we're learning is to really educate effectively. You need time to collaborate effectively, whether that is with other educators, whether it's with paraprofessionals or other school staff, or with parents. And that's a piece that I hope we take with us beyond the pandemic to learn beyond COVID.
Thanks, Marla. I'm curious about, since each of you are working, in states or nationally, if you're seeing, when you hear from teachers and you talk to teachers, if you're seeing real differences between those who are in urban versus suburban or rural areas, and how that kind of can help our understanding of what the needs of educators are right now. Because as you said, Marla, teachers are in individual circumstances. There's not a monolith. And you sort of spoke to this a little bit about the different challenges between maybe being an urban teacher and being in other areas. I don't know, Allison, if you've seen for teachers in Kentucky, sort of distinctions, differences in what the challenges are for teachers across different circumstances.
Sure. We have quite a big difference between some of our rural areas and our urban areas. And actually our two biggest urban areas, Lexington and Fayette County School System and Jefferson County School Systems, have just started going back in person. They were the last districts to do any in-person instruction. It was very difficult because of the needs and the the size of the district and because it was so large and being able to control all of the factors. We had some deaths in our bus drivers in one of our largest districts, and that really caused an issue with being able to find enough bus drivers. And when you can't transport children, you can't get them in the school to be able to have in-person services. Our rural areas had a lot of different things that were going on. We had to have more in-person quicker because we didn't have the internet access all the time, and we weren't able, because when you live in the mountains, in the Appalachian Mountains, you do not always have the correct internet services that you need. Where I live, there were many times I had to message or text my parents and say, I can't do our Zoom today because my internet isn't working because I live between two mountains. So it happens. So yes, there's differences and a lot of similarities as well, because sometimes even in the cities, the inner cities, children did not have the technology, the access to the technology they needed. They might have had the Wi-Fi and better internet services, but they didn't necessarily have the technology they needed to be able to do the work. So it's been difficult. There's, like I said, a lot of similarities, but a lot of differences. Our teachers, though, in the long run, all came out to the same. They really needed the same things. They needed technology. They needed training, as was mentioned earlier. They needed to be able to focus on the things that were important to them in this moment. A lot of times we were still getting training on programs and things that we couldn't even use virtually. So, making sure that those programs and the trainings we were getting were relevant to what we're dealing with in the moment. And I think that's an issue. Like I said, a lot of some programs and things that we couldn't even use, we're really learning for teachers is adequate and what is needed. But definitely seeing the difference between our rural areas and our urban areas in Kentucky.
Does that speak to you, Sanford, in terms of Mississippi? Is it sort of
absolutely. Yes. Of the 22 fellows that we have this year, the vast majority of them are in very small districts, most of them in the Mississippi Delta, but there are other parts of the state that are, just have some of the same challenges that you see in the Delta or anywhere else, in very rural places in the South. Access to not just internet, access to devices, but also access to service providers when you're talking about counseling and mental health and SEL issues. So that is a big issue. And even in Jackson, that's a major issue. So as we go forward, not only do we want to make sure that we're increasing access to those resources, there could be opportunities for districts to partner with local service providers. There could be an opportunity for small districts to partner together. And one other thing, and this is a major concern because there are a lot of federal funds that are coming to the state of Mississippi. And I believe that there are going to be several different organizations that are going to come out and they're going to offer services, but there isn't a lot that's said about the quality of those services. And I'm hoping that as districts start making decisions with, what new curriculum are we going to use, what service providers we're going to try to contract with, are there certain consultants that we're going to try to work with? I hope that teachers get an opportunity to help vet some of those resources to make sure that any dollars that are spent at the local level are spent with folks who know what they're doing and are able to provide quality resources for students.
That's a good segue into my next question, which is
Andy, I'm sorry, could I jump into one thing that I just want to follow on what Sanford said, because I think that involvement piece is so important. In addition to everything that Allison and Sanford mentioned, which resonates with what I know, to me, there's another piece that we found, and that is teachers' needs, as they've expressed them, are different and maybe lesser in places where there's a high level of trust between the teachers and the administration. So if you don't have to worry, am I going to be granted my accommodation because I have an illness that prevents me from teaching right now until I get the vaccine, teaching in person, then you can focus on, okay, do we have all the connectivity and things that we need? If you have the trust around, yes, my voice is being heard, then I know I can say, look, I need some support teaching X remotely, right? Or we want to be able to do reopening in the best way possible for kids. And that means we start with social emotional before we move to academic. But all of that is based on trusting relationships. And we see a lot of differences in places where there are trusting relationships and where the trust is harder to come by for lots of historical reasons.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. When it comes to whether it's the new federal money, or just simply kind of moving past where we currently are into and moving into this, the rest of the school year, the summer and beyond. If we're building back better, to use Chairman Scott's words, what should our priorities be? And most importantly, since we seem to never really ask and answer this question, what should we stop doing? What should we prioritize doing? What have we learned over this past year? And really then what does that mean we really should stop doing from your members' perspective? Anybody can jump in.
Sandy, I'd like to add something here. As we move forward and we're looking at this influx of money into our local districts, I think we really do need to focus on making sure we have enough nurses in our schools. We need to have social workers in our schools, and we need to have plenty of counselors that can really work with students and not have to do all of the other 10,000 things that they've been tasked to do. When you have one in a building who has to do so much other things, it's really hard for them to work with students and their mental health. I think we have to look at the procedures and the policies and the things that we've put in place in the past just because that's the way either it had always been done or that was the way that someone thought was the best way, and we try to conform everything to fit in that. I think we realized during this time that not everything fits in a pretty little box with a bow on top, and we have to look at individual needs of not just our students, but our educators as well. What works for one teacher may not work for another teacher. What one teacher needs in professional development may not be what another teacher needs. And we need to make sure that we're not just checking off boxes to say that we've accomplished whatever it is that somebody at the state level or the federal level has said we need to do. We need to make sure that those things that we're engaging in are relevant and impactful on student growth. I think that's the most important thing going forward. I teach students with special needs, but more specifically, a lot of students with emotional and behavior disorders. And this something that's taught me is that, when these students are not forced to sit in a seat all day long and follow the rules and procedures that we as a society have said they should be as a student, we're not seeing the same behaviors in the virtual world that we would see in the classroom. So that's something we need to look forward to, is how's this impacting students with special needs, both positively and negatively, and how can we learn from that?
I'm concerned about, so there are a lot of devices that students have received. There's a lot of great technology, but I'm wondering a year from now, 2 years from now, will that technology be incorporated into our regular school day? Are we going to maximize the use of that technology, or is this something that's going to just collect dust on a shelf? So I'm hoping years from now, there's professional development for teachers, that there's tech support, that we're not just letting this opportunity just go to waste, but we actually use this to provide greater opportunity for students, not just now, but years down the road.
Thanks. Marla, you want to pick up on any of that?
Sure. Yeah. And absolutely, we have to be thinking about this as a way to pivot to something that's better. And I think one of the things that we've been hearing a lot from teachers is initially this concern about self-efficacy in a new environment, whether that was remote or hybrid. Am I doing as well as I can? But as we've gotten more experience with that, the other thing we hear is, I've been trying new things and using different teaching methods and using techniques, and I don't want to go back to the old way. And I'm going to need some support for that being okay. I mean, teachers have become inventors over the last year in more ways than they have been before. So I think it's incumbent upon policymakers then to be able to enable that. And AFT worked together with the NEA to sort of say, let's just put out a framework. There's a lot of amazing work out there. There are new resources. We absolutely have to be concerned about quality control, but let's put out a framework that says, this is what we should be thinking about when COVID is done. And one of the elements of that is really understanding students' needs at a fine-grained level, both socially, emotionally, and academically. And while I respect everything that Representative Scott says, and he's such an incredible champion for public education, I think one thing that we're not going to get through through statewide assessments is we're not going to get that fine-grained diagnostic support. And I think, and I hope, that some of these new resources can be put toward easy, and they do exist, easy kinds of teacher tools to figure out where kids are, meet them where they are, and bring them forward. Not to think of in a negative deficit-oriented way as learning loss, but I know where we are, so here's where we need to go, and let's bring the supports together that we need to do it.
Sandy, could I add just something quickly too? I think everything that we're saying here is so important, but I don't know how we accomplish any of them if we do not value both the teacher and the student voice going forward. I think it's most important. The students are our clients. They are our people. They're the people that we live for every day, and we design all of these wonderful things we've been talking about. And I think we have to listen to their voices, and I think we have to make sure that they are the ones telling us what worked, what didn't work for the most part, and then using that information to make those changes moving forward and keeping things and dismissing things. But also the teacher voice. We're the ones with our boots on the ground in the classroom, and we're the ones having to implement the policies that are being made by legislators and boards and those people. So we're the ones that are seeing it happen every day. We live it and we breathe it. So our voice is very important at those decision-making tables, because we can tell you exactly what's happening. And as we all know in education world, what happens changes quickly. If you're out of the classroom for more than a couple of years, education in the classroom looks a lot different than it did when you were there. So it's very important to make sure that current voices are being heard all across the.
Yeah, thank you for that, Allison. I think what you're saying just sort of really builds on what Marla and Sanford said as well, right? Which is that we have to go into this sort of recovery period and what comes next, including how this money gets spent, trusting one another and really listening to people's experiences. And it does strike me that a lot of the rules and the systems that we had in place prior to the pandemic may not work very well going forward. And that's going to be a real challenge for school leaders and administrators and others to sort of to transition from. I mean, I've heard teachers say things like, wow, I'm being evaluated this year using a curriculum that was meant for in-person learning by somebody who's never taught remotely. These dynamics have changed and they're evolving quickly. So I think it's going to be a real challenge to go forward, but I appreciate what everyone said about relationship building and making sure that teacher voices at the table as well. I want to just one final kind of question to the group before we move to the students and families and then bring everyone together. And I think, Allison, you picked up on this. One thing that the pandemic uncovered for everyone was systemic inequity, right? If it hadn't been apparent to people before, we certainly saw it starting at the beginning of the pandemic when kids didn't have devices, internet wasn't available, folks didn't get what they needed. And then more recently, your point, Allison, about behavior issues, how we deal with things like absences. Is that a truant problem? Is that, how do we build back better and build back in a way where we just do not accept those systemic inequities that were built into the system? And I'm just wondering would love to have each of you sort of reflect on that and what you're hearing from teachers. Again, back to this idea of what do we stop doing and what must we absolutely do moving forward? Sanford, I'll start with you.
Sure. So one of the things about the pandemic is that it did not create as many problems as it exposed problems. So a lot of the challenges that we're dealing with in Mississippi were problems well before COVID-19 even, arrived in Mississippi. So, we had a teacher shortage long before the pandemic. We did not do the best job of understanding childhood trauma and the role that it plays in education. That was a big problem before the pandemic. And then issues around equitable school funding, that was an issue long before the pandemic. So, COVID-19 just exposed these issues in a new way. And now that we understand the impact that these issues have, I'm hoping that there'll be a greater appetite, not just from our state board members, but also from our legislators and our elected officials to do more on each one of these issues. How do we ensure that every teacher is prepared to like every teacher understands like this is what trauma looks like for the students in my classroom. Here are the resources that I can get those students to. We need to make sure that our schools have the funding and the resources needed to provide every kid an excellent education. And we also need to make sure that we are recruiting and training more teachers, and that teachers have a salary that will keep them in the classroom and we don't lose teachers to surrounding states. So there were major issues before the pandemic, and I'm hoping that we'll recognize that these, if we don't do anything now, that these will be issues after the pandemic. So there's a lot of work for us to do in Mississippi.
Thanks for that. Allison or Marla, any additional thoughts to add?
Sure. Well, first of all, Sanford, I think you said it incredibly well. And I think that what you talked about is not just limited to Mississippi in my experience. The professional issues, how we support the profession, make it well paying. If you think about the bus driver issue, you know that for some people, who are bus drivers, the unemployment is better than the wage that they make. They don't even make a living wage supporting our schools, right? So that's been exposed, as you said, and can no longer stand. And as I think of the ways that we have systemically marginalized students of color, students who are new to the country, students who are English language learners, students who are different in various ways, students with disabilities in a lot of ways. During the pandemic has been front and center, and so many students have been marginalized, right? Because the focus is very different. And so I think this should be a window for us to say that, yes, we need the resources to build back better. And when you can't even change the ventilation systems because you don't have the funding, well, some of this is going to be impacted by the bill that just passed. But there are other things like our policies around discipline racially based discipline and exclusion of kids. Like all of those things are things that we can't hide behind anymore. So I'm excited about that potential. At the same time, as I think, and I hope to hear this from the next panel, parents are not silent, and they're certainly not going to be going forward. And I hope that they recognize that in the vast majority of places they have allies and teachers because we care about the same things for kids.
I just wanted to point out that I'm sorry, Allison, in the chat, there's a lot of confirmation about the issue of, teachers having to take on kind of more tasks than they should, and the real need to have additional counselors and support staff and others really assisting teachers. So yeah, thank you for those comments. Allison, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Just building what Marla just said, parents are not going to be silent now. And I think that's a good thing. I've said for years that our communities and our families, they need to be in our schools more. They need to understand why we do the things we do. We need to understand why they do the things they do, and then come to a consensus on what's best for their children. They're their kids' number one fan. They're going to be part of that child's life well after they're out of school and beyond. And so they have a say in how they will build on their life, how they will be successful, and what happens in the future for these children. We've got to get our community members in our schools. We've got to see how our business people in our communities can add to the way our children learn, and how our children and students can go out into the communities and learn more. And that just goes over into the future and make sure that our employment services are growing instead of unemployment growing. The piece that I published was all about this and the parent engagement. I think some statistics that were included were prior to COVID, that only about 30% of parents were saying that they ever heard from their students' teachers. And now it's like 70%. That doesn't need to go backwards. It needs to continue to go up. That line of communication needs to always be open. And I'll build on something Dr. Hull said earlier. He talked about phantom policies. I'm going to give him one. I think there's mortal policies. I think there are policies that really do exist that we don't necessarily make sure, as I said earlier, are very impactful in doing what they should do. And so a lot of states have parent-family engagement policies. But again, we're checking off boxes. Oh, we have a parent panel, or we have a parent that comes in and volunteers, so we can check that off to say we've got parents in our building. But as we all know, that tends to be the same 4 or 5 people every year that their child is in that school. And it's not really engaging and hearing the voice of all families. And that goes back to an equity concern as well, is to make sure all families at all levels, all races, all everything are being heard and are sharing the voice of.
Well, thank you, Allison. That's a good transition to the student and family panel. I'm really pleased to, first of all, introduce you to our 2 student panelists, Pragya Upreti, who is a high school junior and member of the Kentucky Student Voice Team, who's actually done a lot of research on what students across Kentucky and families across Kentucky have been thinking during the pandemic. Zaid Fattah, who is a high school senior and a California State Board member. And we've also got Gwen Samuel, who is a mom, an education advocate, and a fierce advocate, I should say, and a founder of the Connecticut Parents Union. And finally, Bryant, who's the interim director of EdTrust New York, and before that held multiple roles at the New York City Department of Education, including as a teacher, which is part of the reason so many people on both panels are parents and teachers and have held multiple roles. I'm really looking forward to hearing from this panel and then getting everyone back together too. So I'd like to start with the students. Pragya, if I can start with you, I'd love to hear more about your experience this year and your experience in doing some of your research and what you're hearing from students.
Yeah, so I'm Pragya, I'm a junior at Lafayette High School in Lexington, and this past summer, and honestly, even now, with the Kentucky Student Voice Team, I've spent the last year kind of delving into the qualitative side of our big statewide and nationally recognized study. It was called Coping with COVID-19, a student-to-student survey, where we basically analyzed the social, emotional, and learning experiences of nearly 13,000 students from across our state. We gleaned information and data and the stories really from students from 119 of the 120 counties across Kentucky. And it showed us a lot about what education looks like at this moment. As of right now, we've kind of disseminated our study into 2 separate facets. So the first part of our study was the survey, which once again, it gleaned those thousands of responses. And the second part of it is something that we're currently engaging in, where we recognize that our survey didn't necessarily do the most holistic job of reaching the students in the most rural parts of the state that had typically been most underserved, which once again had been exacerbated during this pandemic. And so we started engaging in peer-to-peer interviews via Zoom, of course, and really getting to the heart of student experiences during this moment of distance learning and such shifting circumstances within public education. And so what we learned was a lot. And honestly, I think I could be here for hours talking about the things that we've learned. And so many members of our team have been on so many panels talking about this information. But I don't think there's any one sentence more than just our education is immensely fragile at this moment. And that almost to me encompasses what we learned from this study. Statistically, we have learned that students reported a drastic decrease in the manageability and meaningfulness of their coursework. They experienced a decrease in their self-perceptions of meaningfulness. And so throughout several of the short answer responses that we disseminated, many students reported feeling that content no longer felt meaningful due to the multiple crises surrounding them. And so I think in this moment, we've kind of always boxed ourselves out into being in a pandemic, which of course by no means wasn't a small feat and still isn't, but we've also dealt with so much with these constant moves towards racial justice in our country. And so for a lot of us as student researchers, being able to hear how students across our state were connecting both the pandemics of COVID-19 and systemic racism into their educational experience, that spoke volumes for us, because a lot of times things like that are overlooked in an education system, and specifically how those experiences directly inform the way a student's learning experiences turn out. there was a very striking correlation between the decreased frequency of teacher communications and a larger drop in student motivation and overall engagement within their coursework. 65% of the students we've surveyed reported their teacher communicated with them less than one time per week, and consequently reported a decrease in motivation, as opposed to the 55% of students whose teachers communicated with them more than twice a week. And then something that really sticks out to me was that there was a vast desire for a shift from logistical to meaningful communication. And what we mean by that is, I guess, just by a matter of personal experience, it's shifting communication from talking about, oh, you have this many missing assignments, you have these things you need to finish on your agenda tonight, to a simple, how are you doing? Is there anything that I can do for you? Something that we can work out together to make our whole educational process more flexible. And so that shift in communication really informed what a student's educational experience looked like, by and large. And so I think overall, when it comes to one of the biggest parts of the data that we had gleaned from this study was role changes between both students and teachers. 60% of students reported doing more cooking and 70% more cleaning. Female students saw a disproportionately larger increase in responsibilities compared to their male peers. And so there were also students who felt safer at home than at school, students who lacked consistent Wi-Fi access, and students of lower socioeconomic statuses, who all tended to have negative emotional changes. And so, for example, a greater proportion of poor and working class students reported feeling more depressed after COVID than before, compared to their middle and upper class peers. And so students of a lower socioeconomic status, who often felt that their schoolwork was less manageable, and students who felt less emotionally or physically safe, generally had overall more negative behavioral changes. And so I've kind of put all of this information out there just for framing, because once again, going back to the original point, our education system is so fragile in this moment. And from what was stated earlier too, a lot of these discrepancies that we're seeing and hearing about, while we're talking about them now, they've only been exacerbated during the pandemic. And I often think, it's really sad and difficult to think how it took a pandemic and so much economic and racial disparity to kind of illuminate these changes. But now that we have reached this moment, I think we should be using it as an opportunity to be better moving forward. But yeah, a lot of the data that we had gleaned from this study really spoke to the meaningfulness not only of student voices, but how those voices can now inform policy changes moving forward across this year.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Zaid?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm Zaid Fattah. I'm a senior at Monte Vista High School in Danville, California, and I'm also a student member of the California State Board of Education. And I think that my experiences and the things that I've been seeing in the field really parallel the research that Pragya just explained. And also from my interactions with students from across California, it really seems that students are now facing more so a crisis of focus rather than of content. Students and adults alike are just having an extremely difficult time concentrating and focusing in school with all the stresses of everything going around them, as well as the temptations of just distractions surrounding them virtually. And I think that students are starting to experience this kind of standstill in their education where they don't have the motivation to be able to complete just basic assignments because there are just so many distractions going on in the world. And so I think it's starting to really become apparent that it's less kind of a crisis of content, because we can really go on Google and find anything to supplement our education. We have our classes, our teachers are doing just an amazing job delivering content in the classroom. And so now it's just a matter of being able to focus and really get back that ability to concentrate on tasks that we had when we were in-person learning.
Thank you for that. Before I move on to Gwen and Dia, just have a couple of questions for the two of you. It strikes me that I appreciate the framing, by the way, of fragile, because I think the teacher panelists would not disagree with you. I think educators also feel pretty fragile right now, as do parents. But I wonder, when you hear the discussions at the state and national level about education issues, things like learning loss and testing and accountability and these things that have been so much part of the system for 20 years, just wonder how that strikes students at this moment, or how that lands with students at this moment? Because it feels like what you're saying is that must feel pretty disconnected given the day-to-day experiences that students are having.
Yeah, and I will say, I mean, I think I feel the same way about that as I do with curriculum in our school. I mean, I guess to start with the overall, I've spent the whole year virtual, and just last week I came back to school for the first time, full 5 days a week. And I think all of us recognize that everyone's kind of in the slump right now. We're all transitioning back to this new normal that everyone's talking about. I guess trying to achieve what was once normal. But I will say that our work recognizes that normal wasn't working. And we shouldn't rush back to what normal looked like, because it almost got us where we are today. And so before I get to what you would ask, I think it's also good to frame it in a way to say that the normal that we were talking about, that a lot of us are kind of rushing to get back to, that a lot of our school systems and districts have been putting at the forefront of this push to go back, it's what contributed to these socioeconomic discrepancies and the lack of equitable distribution of remote learning resources at this moment, the digital divide that's more apparent than ever, and of course at the forefront, racial disparities. And so to your point about that disconnectedness, I think, to me, it really is imperative in two things. One, in testing, like you were talking about, we've spent all year online. We've spent all year learning off of Chromebooks that haven't necessarily been comparable to any sort of in-person learning environment. I've been in several AP classes that I would be doing so many lab reports in person, just communications in general, that I haven't been able to do. We've been doing all of our chemistry labs on spreadsheets, and for high school students, that's not necessarily the way you learn. And it wasn't something that we could really control at the moment. But then the question goes to, how do you go about testing that? How do you go to testing what a student is learning at this moment in an environment where our world is in a completely different format, but our tests aren't in a different format? And so that's where these accommodations and things like that come in. To me, it's like, I don't want to play the capitalism card, but it's all about money at the end of the day. And so for a lot of students that are involved in AP testing and things like that, we've paid hundreds of dollars to take these tests back in November. And so now at this moment of like, do I still continue taking this test? Because I don't think I've learned anything, or at least compared to what I would be learning and the experiences I would be having if I was in person. And so the second thing I really see that in is curriculum, because, for me and a lot of other students in my school, students of color in particular, that have, we've seen the apex of racism in this country, and we're living through that at this moment. And so when we continuously read books from authors that are primarily white, and we learn about history from a very whitewashed perspective, it's things like that that kind of compound on each other that allow us to say, yeah, this makes me feel very disconnected from the things that I should be learning and the experiences that I should be having in my school.
Thank you. I want to bring Dia and Gwen into the conversation. I think Gwen agreed with absolutely everything you both have said, both Zaid and Pragya, and you should both feel free to jump in. I don't know why I was worried that we wouldn't hear enough from the two of you, but please jump in at any point, because your voice is so valuable here. Gwen, I just want to, as someone who is an advocate and works with parents every day, with families every day, I just want you to sort of pick up on this and your experience, and maybe, how similar is it to what Pragya and Zaid have said? Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yes, sir. First, to both Pragya and Zaid, I'm like, I can retire now, right? I think, our country's in good hands with leaders like you. I'll start with that. With that being said, I just appreciate the real talk from both of you, because what I am concerned about and what parents are concerned about, I can speak from Connecticut and actually working with parents across this country, that we are concerned of the kumbaya piece here. Like, we can just go back to business as usual. Business as usual did not meet the needs of the millions of the diverse learning styles and needs of children across this country. It didn't work prior to the pandemic. So I always get concerned. People say we have lost kids. Well, you barely could engage them when it was prior to the pandemic, you know, and now I'm seeing in my state, we're using punishments like police knocking on on house doors when you're not logging in, even though a community could not even probably have a tower, which I'm learning in some of our areas, with actual service to provide the internet. And so we're punishing families for circumstances that are beyond their control, for unpredictable and unprecedented pandemic. And I'm concerned that I'm gonna call it rhetoric. And I think if we're going to improve, we have to have real talk like these young people stated, because the data we're seeing, like, you know, we're transitioning okay back to reopening schools. And what we're hearing from a survey from like Pragya, I see a disconnect, right? And so what I'm hoping and going to be advocating for is, it's not only just remembering, you know, we have to remember that students are stakeholders too. Parents are stakeholders too in this, and that it's not enough to just listen, but incorporate some of these recommendations into some of our public policies. And I hear people say, well, we're at the table. If getting at the table means I get a chair, but you don't hear me, or you don't incorporate, then leave the chair out then, okay? Because I need you to not only hear what we are saying as parents and students, but actually incorporate it to create the norm that puts students at the center of public education. And I kind of wondered, are children actually the center of public education as we speak? So if we don't get them as the center, then we're still going to be stuck in pre-pandemic mode. So first and foremost, we must put students at the center of public education, especially within these reform efforts. And I think that's where we're struggling, putting them literally the nucleus of public education, and every adult intersection should be about what's best for them. And that's not what parents and just based on what prayers and what we're seeing.
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in here. You know, I'm very grateful for the perspectives that Priya and Zaid share. As Sandy mentioned, I was a teacher. I was also a school founder and principal for a number of years, and most recently left central office prior to taking this post. And so I think that the two of you and the results of your survey are amazing, because we very rarely hear from students. And I want to complicate your story a little bit. The AP courses that you talk about are not actually available to all students. In fact, we know for sure that Black students, Latinx students, and those from low-income households, similar to mine as I grew up, it just wasn't available. And we know that that's still true today in 2021. And in addition, we also know that many of those same students in this complicated narrative that I'm offering often don't even have teachers of same race or same background, or, you know, some of those are also just some of the disadvantages. And my concern is that even returning to whatever the next normal is, or whatever is next, those will still be the case, right? And to your point, Pragya, these inequities existed pre-pandemic, and they've only been exacerbated. And if they were destitute pre-pandemic, and those two that I mentioned have been exacerbating, I am afraid of the classroom that my 11-year-old will return to, because we have not addressed suspension as a form of learning loss, and how suspensions disproportionately impact the lives of Black girls and Black boys throughout this country. And that's a real thing. When we think about Ed Trust New York just completed a poll of parents across the state of New York. And the number one concern amongst parents who have infants and toddlers and parents who have students in K-12 is significant developmental loss, meaning they are very afraid of what this pandemic has done, to your point, around their kids' self-confidence, their sort of self-affirmation, who they are as a learner, as an intellectual. And I think they're right to be concerned. And I think they're even more right to be concerned about what we return to. And so as we think about that, distance learning has been complicated for families. It's been a year in and we're still struggling. And although that's the truth for some folks, I imagine that there are groups of people who will decide to keep this. And I think that we need to think about how do we fortify those learning experiences for families that will still choose this methodology. I think there's another thing that we're not talking about enough, which is sort of the transition into post-secondary space, right? And what it means to have had an incomplete 11th grade or 12th grade year for the last 2 years, to not have the counseling that you need for sort of college and career readiness. I remember I'm a first generation student, and my mom was fortunate enough to work for very wealthy people who helped her find a college counselor. And that woman walked my mother through the entire process for my older brother, which inherently left her with tools to help the remaining 3 of us. I think of who would have helped my mother in this moment. I think of how we would have had quality applications for any post-secondary opportunity, albeit career or undergraduate. And that's a real concern for students who are in households that are below 50,000 or even below the federal poverty level. So I think we need to think about what this summer looks like for our students. How do we enrich their lives with some cultural experiences and make sure that they are at least primed for what they will encounter in September? Those are some of my big questions. Sandy, that's sort of where I'm thinking right now.
Yeah, I appreciate actually everything that everyone has said. That's all, it's so interesting. And it's so, to be honest, it's so unlike most conversations I fear are happening out there. This is a really, for everyone sort of listening in this space, I think this is a relatively unique conversation. And if you are a policymaker, this is what people are thinking, right? This is what folks on the ground that you are serving are thinking. And if you don't know this, if this is any of this is a surprise to you, or you're just going about thinking about how those new rescue funds are going to be spent, or how we just get back to where we were before. And I hope the takeaway from this conversation and the educator conversation is that, like, if you don't have students and families and educators at every single decision-making table, and not in a check the box kind of way, you aren't really hearing from the community you think you're serving. And that is a huge mistake. And I want to go back to something that Gwen, on this point, that Gwen said to me when we were doing our prep call. Did Gwen disappear on us?
No,
anyway.
I'm here.
Oh, there you are. You disappeared. You moved on my screen.
Okay.
Gwen said to us when we were on our phone call, which is that one of the interesting things about remote learning, right, about this time when we all were forced to pause, no matter how long that lasted for people, is that parents got to look behind the curtain. They got to see what school looked like. Some of them built relationships with teachers and are muddling through and doing the best they can. Other people are not so sure what they think about the system they've been engaging in. And other people now are a lot smarter about what their kids are doing. And so I also think and Gwen, I'd love to have you talk about this for a second. One of the sort of positive aspects from this past year is that there are a lot of parents, in addition to a lot of students, who have a lot of opinions about what should come next. And they're a lot smarter about it because they have seen. And so I just wanted to pick up on really your point, Gwen, that you raised with me the other day. Like, before you didn't know what you didn't know, but now you know.
Right. And that's the awakening, right? So there is this aha moment that is happening across the country with parents, like, oh, the guilt trip. I thought I knew you. I thought I was supporting you in school. And then I have a year to talk to you, because my job is closed down and I'm getting to know you. I thought you were alien and realized you are my baby again. And now, and so, right. And so we're communicating with each other. And then I'm like, oh, I thought you were at this grade level reading. I didn't know you were here. And I thought I knew what I really didn't know, right? And so now the guilt trip comes in, but the beauty of it is now we can work together to correct another course of action to improve. And so which raises questions of, okay, what's really happening in the school I send my child to? Is this really the right fit? And do I want to go back there knowing what I know now? And again, it's not about blaming anyone, right? It's not saying something's bad or good, but they're starting to know their child, right? There's 4 things I say: know your child, know your school, know your community. But for parents, most importantly, know yourself. Because when you know yourself as a parent, I know my strength. I might be a no joke advocate. And I tried homeschooling. It did not work for me. As much as I think I know, I would, work 20 jobs and get a pod or work with educators and build those relationships. I know myself. That wasn't my strength. My kids would be PlayStation all day and convince me they were doing the homework on the screen. I'd be like, that looks like a Call of Duty. No, Mom, that is the teacher teaching us about war and history. And because I'll be talking to you all, I'm like, okay, good, you're doing good, right? So no, homeschool didn't work for me. But that doesn't mean there are those who are looking at other options. And to one other thing I will say, I'm concerned about when I hear all this money influx, but I don't hear the word accountability. And you don't just pour money in something, because to Pragya's point and everything, and to Prayer's point, will we be funding the same norm, right? The outcomes that we did not get. We're trying to apply pre-pandemic strategies to an unpredictable pandemic time. And so how does that translate to results with the money? The taxpayer, we just don't have it like that. We need to have a return on the investment. We have to know that what every single dollar that it is reaching the child, or that it is reaching the supports they need to support their child. It's not about supporting adults for adults' sake. It's about that adult as they intersect with the child. So what I'm saying, bottom line is, there is an aha moment and an awakening. And educators and principals and administrators, they will have to deal with those questions that parents will now be asking that they weren't sure about maybe before the pandemic, but they're more clear now. And so there's no more rhetoric here. Parents want clear answers, clear solutions, and working with them, not for them. Because when you do for them, then you're speaking for me. I am very capable of working with you. Help me understand so we can support better outcomes for children.
Well said. I'm hoping the teachers will bring themselves back on. Marla, Allison, and Sanford, if you can put your videos on, and there you go, and unmute yourself so you can join the conversation. I'm curious, for the 3 of you, now that you've heard a little bit from family perspective and the student perspective, I wonder if you've got any thoughts about what you heard. I'll start with you, Marla.
Thanks, Sandy. My thought is that I'd like to mostly keep quiet and continue to listen to this panel, especially the students, for a really long time, because I think we have to, Gwen, you just said it, we have to center voice of the people who speak for themselves, not speak for others. And this has been really powerful. I wanted to mention 2 quick things. One is that I think the research that you did, Pragya, is a great advertisement for project-based learning opportunities and action research. You did something that mattered to you. It was a learning experience, whether it was part of your school curriculum or not, it sure was. Dia, I wanted to lift up what you talked about in terms of learning loss and how so many marginalized students have had learning loss before COVID, right? Whether we pushed students out because we didn't engage them or made them feel other, or discipline referrals kept them out of classrooms. Right now, we're seeing what this looks like. And instead of figuring out how we remedy it, we're talking about how do you do truancy and discipline work online, and what constitutes an infraction in an online class, right? And so the other thing it made me think of is that the notion of learning loss, which it was said by the head of Math for America that learning loss is a calculation masquerading as a concept. Like, let's not get lost in measuring it. let's figure out what's happening and deal with it. But I want to not speak because I really enjoy hearing from this group. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from Zaid, especially in his role as a student board member. But before we do, I just want to say one thing about learning loss. And this is something for us to like keep in the back of our minds, especially as we think about the rescue plan money. If you talk to a principal, they will tell you that they are getting 15, 20 emails a day with the solutions and district level people too, right? With the solutions to learning loss, everyone's got a package, everyone's got a promise for how to fix learning loss. And there is going to be, with so much money now entering the system, there is going to be a real push for people to find the magic bullet solution. And not only, I think people have said before, like, wow, students and teachers and families ought to be part of figuring out what our priorities are and how to solve the problems and whether these tools are the right tools. But boy, like, we're all going to have to get in there really fast, because just know that the marketing folks are already, are already there, and they're marketing solutions to problems that you might not even think are problems you have. So it's something to be super careful about. But Zaid, I don't want to take up your time, so I'd love to hear more from you about your role.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. I just really quickly wanted to kind of extend a point that Pragya brought up a little bit earlier and kind of connect it back to something that Gwen was saying a little bit earlier as well. So Pragya really hit the nail, I think, on the head in terms of the way that students are kind of approaching learning in the classroom and curriculum. And then Gwen really talked about how parents are starting to become a little bit more cognizant of the things that are going on within school districts and within the classroom. And what I think I've noticed just from being a student member on the state board is that this cognizance has really been extending to students. So now I think students are not just learning about learning in the classroom, but we're really becoming more aware of how the system works, how school boards work, how district like local accountability works. And I think that really has kind of birthed this next generation of student leaders in education. Particularly here in California, we have this organization called Gen Up. It stands for Generation Up. And it's actually California's largest youth education advocacy organization. And at the very beginning of the pandemic, it had, just dozens of students. But now, over the past year, it's grown to almost, it's grown to thousands. I think it's somewhere upwards of 5,000. So I think that the interest in students to become more interested in investigating their education system, be it through the accountability, the things that are occurring on state boards of education, on their district boards of education, has really kind of birthed new leadership positions for students as well on their district school boards. It's really started to kind of push students to advocate to get student member positions on their district or on their state boards of education. And it's really kind of just, I guess, made this perspective a lot more aware for decision makers, be it at the state or local level.
Thank you for that. It strikes me that one of the things I think there's a lot of concern in this group about is this sort of the systems, right, that we're all operating in are big and mammoth, and they have a life of their own, right? And they have been around for a long time. And they're now about to get kind of this big influx of funding. And there is such a strong desire among many, maybe not all of us panelists, but many, to like snap back to where we were before. Like, how do we go back? Wow, I just want normal. What does normal look like? I'll take any normal. So there's this sort of tendency to snap back, new influx of money, and the system. And you've all identified tons of issues that the pandemic laid bare: technology, inequities, funding, lack of access, relationship building, all of these things that are like so critical. Mental health, so critical to like a really healthy system. And I think the thing we're all trying to contend with is, how do we move forward, right? How do we make what comes next better? And so my first question to you is, but I'll say when you have a seat at these district and state tables about what the priorities for this spending should be, what would you prioritize? But then secondly, how do we make sure that student, parent, and teacher voice is central in this conversation and is not an afterthought? It is is actually at the heart of the conversation.
Sandy, can I jump in first? Because I want to build off of Zaid's point. And I want to start with a historical perspective, which is the fact that we use the word system, although there's not one single system, right?
Yeah.
And even what we acknowledge as a single system has been bifurcated from its very inception. So if you look at how the common school was established, it very specifically left Black people out of it and has since left racial fault lines and income-based fault lines throughout the system, throughout history. And so for a very long time, we've had a tiered system of educating people in this country. And if you had a certain level of affluence and a certain racial profile, you got the great education. And if you did not, you got what was left. And so I think that however these funds are used, they must solve for that. And the thing is if we begin to solve for this bifurcation that we've had for so long, and we actually can link all of our futures together because they're linked anyway. So our refusal to address this fault line has brought us to where we are. Mm-hmm. And if we are not careful about how we use funding, specifically centering how we make education a single quality experience for every child in our country, we will replicate the exact same thing that we had previously, and we may do it worse than before.
Appreciate that. I also think there's something to be said.
And you'd like to add?
Yeah, go ahead, Allison.
I'd just like to build on what she just said. I feel like no matter what we all sit here today and say that this funding should be towards, going back to something Gwen said earlier, you can give me a seat at the table, but if you're listening, that seat doesn't matter. And I think that is true with all of these systems we're talking about. Each system kind of seems to still be in its own silo. We have our legislators on one silo. We have our Board of Educations at the state level and local levels at completely different silos. We have parents on one. We have all of these people on different silos, and we need to take those. And we need to say that we are not the ones on each of our silos who know what's best for everyone else on all their silos. We need to come together. We need to have all those voices and they need to be heard, not just another box shop. And until we do that, we can all on our own silos be saying the same exact thing, but no one's listening. We have people right now in our state trying to figure out how to use this money. You have the federal regulations that are giving you information on how to use it. And then the states build on that with their own regulations. And then it trickles down to our local districts. And then people at the local districts are saying, wait a minute, who's making those decisions? Who's deciding how we get to spend our money? Are all the voices being heard? Or is there just one or two people sitting around the table deciding how that's done? So we have to check ourselves and realize, that we can't keep making decisions about education without everybody there that is impacted by those decisions. We still have legislators going into committees, talking about new ed. We can all on our own silos be saying education bills, who's deciding they can't answer because they didn't know it because they're not a teacher in the classroom. We've got to make sure that the people impacted by the policies we're developing and passing are the people at the table talking about them and how the outcome that trickles down to our local districts, making those decisions. Who's deciding how we get to spend our money? Our funding is being used in a way that will impact our students, not just today, not just tomorrow, but 10 years from now. We can't make decisions on, we need to hire a teacher to be an interventionist right at this moment when that funding is going to be gone for years and the district no longer has money to continue paying that teacher. We have to look at what's best for now, how we get back in our schools safely, but also how does the money, they didn't know it because they're not a teacher in the class right at this moment when that funding is going to be just from years from now so that we continue to see positive outcomes. Our students not just for now.
Gwen?
And I would just say, for me, that this is all about looking at children in real time, right? Because if you approach this from a real-time perspective, then you automatically have to look at whether you're calling learning loss, unfinished instruction, whatever it is, these babies have lost, good or bad, a year's worth of, whether it's formal, whether it's additional supports, whether it's counseling, because we have, in Connecticut, we have wraparound services in our schools, right? So special needs children like are totally off the grid almost, especially if they have specific support systems embedded in their IEPs that, these were outside, consultants, so that came in, or vendors, right? So we need to, if you got 500,000 children, then there should be like, okay, we got 500,000 kids we got to worry about, right? And so that's not, okay, now black, white, we know those are 500,000 individuals. And so we figure out, what do those individuals need to get back on track? But I'm gonna put back on track in quotes, because some of these kids weren't on track before the pandemic came. Yeah. So this pandemic has created, as tragic as it has been, has created a silver lining, so that we can now see individual students with individual needs. And and again, shout out to the survey, and then shout out to Zaid and all the bringing the youth from a couple of hundred students to thousands, because there is an awakening, and they're saying we don't want to go back. So for me, whatever the solutions need to be, they need to be real talk, no rhetoric, call it what it is. We don't need flavor of the month education, real time. Because if we're not starting from that point, then we are already behind the curveball, and you will hear from parents and an uprising of students. So I suggest we as adults try to figure it out on the front end, because these babies are on our heels holding us to task, because we are supposed to be making responsible and informed decisions on their behalf until they get to the place that they're making these decisions for themselves. And that's a tall order, and we just got to get better.
One thing I hear all of you saying, which is, in retrospect, it's a little bit surprising, right? That that these systems, multiple systems, many of which were not built for everyone that they're serving, that is for sure, that rarely in these systems are the people that are supposed to be served, whether this is the district or the state level, like really engaged in decisions about priorities, right? And I've also heard from a number of folks that is a rare occurrence. I think this happens, Kentucky's a good example of where this happens in an intergenerational way with the Kentucky Student Voice Team, but rarely do you see situations or circumstances where students, families, and educators are together having these conversations. And I do wonder, like, in some ways, so long as the three most important pieces of the system continue to be siloed in these conversations, right? What would happen? How powerful would it be if the three most impacted groups, all of which are represented right here, were actually engaged together, right? As opposed to, being sort of not just siloed from the discussions, but siloed from each other. And it strikes me that some of the exciting things that are happening in Kentucky, in fact, are happening because you see those intergenerational conversations happening with educators as well. And I think that is actually, as we think about how to build back better, thinking about how we build these relationships among those that are most impacted is maybe a challenge to us too. I think somebody raised their hand. Was it Pragya?
Yeah, and I wanted to add really quickly, because I think what everyone's saying is so incredible right now. And I'm so glad you brought up intergenerational partnerships, because at the core of everything we do at the Kentucky Student Voice Team is those intergenerational partnerships. We don't say student voices without also talking about the adult allies that are behind the work that we do. I think they're so key in everything that we do. And it speaks on a nationwide level too. But I also want to say that we like to say that student voices are on a continuum. And so the way we really meaningfully and critically look at it is from expression to consultation to participation and then partnerships and then activism. And then at the apex, it's leadership. And so the reason why I kind of like, I put that to perspective there is because I think that representation, and this was mentioned earlier too, that representation in education or spaces of education policy, it sets the premise for our democracy. Whenever we have representation on state boards of education, we also, it normalizes the presence of students and educators on our district boards, on our SBDM councils, on our PTAs, you know, things that kind of trickle down into our education system that more and more meaningfully impact students and educators at the front line of their educational experience. And then I think was mentioned earlier too, that was super interesting, was this whole checking off the box mentality that is we're all too familiar with, especially when it comes to that meaningful representation that we're looking for. And I think, I guess, to put that into words, it's mostly like we're avoiding tokenization. We're avoiding being that visual representation of equity without actually having a voice. And I love the analogy of having a seat at the table doesn't necessarily mean that my voice is being portrayed as meaningful as it actually is. A lot of times that means being able to vote on boards of education. And if that's not there, then representation doesn't necessarily feel as valid. And so I think at the heart of that, it's just genuinely using our stories and our experiences, especially now, as ways to meaningfully impact policy changes. And so I guess the big end goal that I like to think of, and everyone, you know, within the student voice team really frames our conversations around, is that we are trying to bridge our schools with our society. We don't want our schools to be looked at as institutions that are entirely separate from the disparities that are very present in our society every single day. I mean, we live through these discrepancies, and if we don't have a say in mending that, and its implications for our education system, then we're failing as a community, to be honest. And so I guess just that was a lot, but to kind of encapsulate everything, our democracy thrives when primary stakeholders are an integral part of the decision-making process. And to me, that's what building back better should look like. It's meaningfully engaging with students and educators at the core of our education system, without tokenization, but with the recognition of the implications of how we can change these systems. And I'm going to use that in quotes now, because I think what was brought up earlier is so important, that we use systems in a way without recognizing the intersectionality of all of this. But by keeping students and educators and parents at the core of that, you know, engaging in collective discussions that allow all of our stories to be at the center of policy change, and allowing the legislators and policymakers that are currently making decisions who largely don't have direct connections with public schools in this country, to recognize that we have power too, and that our voices are meaningful and hold a lot of strength in institutionally changing what systems look like in this country.
Thank you.
I just want to say real quick that I'm sorry. I just want to say I apologize to you all that you don't have a Kentucky Student Voice team, and I hope you get one like them soon, because we are blessed to have these children with their state and their voices.
Thanks for that. We've got just another minute or two left before we need to let people transition. Any other final words, thoughts, anything that was sort of left unsaid? I think we've sort of left a challenge to state board members and other leaders here. Get yourself some students, and not students that you pick necessarily the way you may currently see them. Like, get yourself a diverse group of students that represent your whole state and your the whole experience that students are having, and listen to them. And same goes with parents and educator voice too. So I think we've laid down that challenge both for now and for the future. We need to do a lot more conversation with the folks that are most impacted by the policies that we're pursuing.
All I would say is it's all hands on deck at this point.
Absolutely.
All hands. That includes your small businesses, your corporates, everyone's here. I mean, because it's not about, I'm not going to say build back better. I don't want what was back. Okay. I'm going to be honest, point blank. I just want to build better. with children as the nucleus. And if your conversation in public education doesn't center around the child, then I am not that parent that you want to engage, because you will not be a good conversation. So make the babies, I'm not saying young adults. And I look forward to voting for Pragya and Zaid as co-presidents of the United States one day. I don't know if we ever had two presidents, but it might be new democracy going on, and the many students in Kentucky that will follow. Thank you, my young people, our young people, just leading by example and just showing what intergenerational collaboration looks like in real time, not rhetoric, in real time. So thank you for that.
I'm trying to figure out how I can recruit them to come teach in Mississippi. That would be a dream. And I'm hoping that we can create this environment where more young advocates will look to education as a way where they can impact young people and at the same time advocate for policy change, not just at the district level, but at the state and national level. So I hope to see y'all in the classroom at some point. If it's in Mississippi, great. If not, Kentucky is fine. Like any other state would be great too.
Zaid, do you want to give a final thought?
Yeah, I would love to. I'd just like to say that, first of all, I've had a really nice time sharing the panel with all of you. You guys are clearly all just as passionate on education, and you guys all shared such interesting ideas that I'm sure that every single person who is watching will definitely take into consideration and take into account. And I think that as we start to look forward, we should, as Gwen was saying earlier, not build to be back to where we were, but build to be better than where we were. And so I really urge everyone to start leading by listening, listening to stakeholders, be they students, be they parents, be they teachers, and trying to really form an education system that is community-based and really listens to the community.
Thank you. That is the perfect way to end. Lead by listening. That's terrific. Abby, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Sandy. And to all of the panelists, I cannot express my thanks enough. Marla, Sanford, Allison, great perspectives on teacher, Gwen and Dia, wonderful comments. And to our students, you are a testament to the power of student voice on a state board of education. Thank you all so much for your work and for your participation in this panel. I have to say, one of the things I love about this conference is not only the engaging sessions, but what happens next in state board meetings across this nation as we hear further conversations of how states can work with parents, students, families, and teachers to build back, I want to make sure I get this right, better than we were before, to use the quote from this particular session. I wish I could offer you a round of applause, a chorus of cheers, a standing ovation, but I haven't figured out how to do that in a virtual environment. So I'll just say thank you one last time. And to